Welcome to part 10 of 10 of the longest video series I've ever done and will ever do. For anyone tuning in late, here's a quick review of the structure of this series. In looking at all the reasons for the existence of suffering, there are the four following answers we usually hear from monotheistic religions: that suffering is punishment, or suffering benefits us, or suffering must exist for the greater good of free will, or that the reason for suffering is just beyond our finite understanding. Then there's the Eastern explanation that the perceived world is just an illusion, so suffering too is just an illusion. Then there are the answers that we sometimes hear from dualistic and polytheistic religions, that the divine is not all-powerful, or the divine is not all good. And finally, there's the non-supernatural answer that the natural world is indifferent to creature suffering. And in looking at these various answers, the question I've been asking throughout this series is, which explanation or combination of explanations can most accurately describe and predict a large class of observations? And by large class of observations, I mean suffering that people bring upon themselves, suffering that people bring upon others, and the suffering that's inherent in nature. All right, we're now up to the very last explanation for the existence of suffering, and this is the secular answer that the natural world is indifferent. And this is the only explanation, as far as I can tell, that can coherently and reliably explain all observations and make predictions that agree with observations. Let's look at the first category, suffering that people bring upon themselves. Now, this needs no presence of an active and punitive creator to explain things. The reckless spender causes his own bankruptcy. The thief is punished by the community he has offended. No mysteries here. Now, sometimes people misbehave and don't get punished. As the character called Job says in Job chapter 21, verses 29 through 30. Ask anyone who's been around, and he can tell you the truth, that the evil man is usually spared in the day of calamity and allowed to escape. Now, this was disturbing to Job because he was struggling with the notion of a just and powerful God who was not supposed to let this kind of thing happen. But if Job had the naturalistic perspective that there's only fallible humans to put a stop on the misbehavior of our fellow humans, Job would not have been so disturbed, because an imperfect track record from humans is pretty much what we would expect to see. All right, moving on to the second category, suffering that people bring upon innocent people. Now, one of the things that makes this category complex is that people can be incredibly cruel to one another, but they can also be incredibly compassionate. But still, the naturalistic perspective explains both extremes and everything in between. And this was something I discussed at length in my last video series. The title of that was called The Pre-Religion and Pre-Human Roots of Morality. And in that video, I discussed how the evidence for aggression and cruelty's role in the struggle for survival is well known. But on the other hand, traits like compassion and cooperation, they also have their role, particularly when it comes to reproductive success. Now, the traits of aggression and cruelty are unfortunately still with us. And one of the reasons is that aggression still can result in profitable results for the aggressor, if they can get away with it. I mean, like if the thief can get away without being caught, he can steal the products of someone else's labor without having to work for it for himself. And that goes for whether we're talking about the gunman at a bank or a corporate higher-up who is redirecting employee pension funds into his own Swiss bank account. Now, a community's self-interest will generate laws designed to reduce community-destroying tendencies as much as possible. Because communities that survive do so because they create disincentives for destructive behavior. Disincentives like fines or prison or just public shame. Still, even these things are unlikely to completely eliminate destructive tendencies. Because I'll go on just yet another tangent here. Any government strong enough to completely squash people, to completely stop people from hurting one another, would probably have to squash all freedom. And the result of that would be substituting abuse from our fellow individuals to having abuse from an all-controlling totalitarian government. Or in other words, a cure that's even worse than the disease. So it's no surprise that most governments have come to some sort of balance where people are given enough freedom so that they're not totally oppressed by the government. But still, sometimes they'll use that individual freedom and it'll spill over into some people taking advantage of others. And when it comes to aggression between two or more countries where there's no overarching government law to impose disincentives for taking advantage of others, well, that's where we can find total savagery, total cruelty. All right, moving on to the third category of suffering that's inherent in nature. Disease, natural disasters, the whole prey versus predator setup. And none of these things are any surprise to find in a world that doesn't have any benign supernatural being watching over it. Take the fact that our Earth's crust is made up of giant plates, and that our planet's core is hot, and that the heat makes these plates move, and sometimes they'll strain against each other until the plates break, and that shakes the Earth above it. If the area above that strain is populated by a peaceful village that ends up totally demolished, taking the secular perspective means that there's no desperate struggle to try to find meaning in this destruction. There's no need to wonder if God was punishing the villagers because of maybe too much homosexual behavior, or because they were worshiping forbidden idols. Or let's look at the way that life feeds upon life. Evolution's driving force of favoring whatever best survives and reproduces. Now this can explain how a wide range of life forms can result. Everything from flowers to viruses to the macabre mothering of this wasp called the digger wasp. And this wasp lays her eggs inside a caterpillar, and the wasp's venom paralyzes the caterpillar, but just enough so that it can't move, but it doesn't kill it. And this way the meat stays fresh, so the larva can slowly eat the caterpillar alive. Now this arrangement works as far as perpetuating life goes. The caterpillar, of course, may feel some pain from being slowly eaten alive, but that's something that natural selection is completely indifferent to. So when it comes to making sense out of suffering here on Earth, one of the things that the naturalistic answer does is make sense of all observations. The suffering of people who misbehave and get punished, the lack of suffering of people who misbehave and don't get punished, the suffering of innocent victims, and the suffering that's inherent in nature. Now this may not be a happy conclusion, but I think the religious explanations can make people even more unhappy, because the religious explanations force people to torture their reason. I mean, take an explanation like the explanation that the reason that millions of small children die from diarrhea-related dehydration every year is that because Eve took a bite of fruit, and that fruit bite made God curse the ground. Now, to me, trying to believe that this answer came from a benign creator of the universe, that's even more disturbing than realizing that we live in an indifferent universe and that we have only ourselves to both hurt and care for each other. Now, besides being free of the mental pain that comes with supernatural explanations, another big advantage of the secular explanation is that when we look at nature-based suffering from the viewpoint of natural science, and when we look at human-caused suffering from the viewpoint of the social sciences, that is sociology and psychology and the like, the benefit is that the sciences not only stand a better chance of coherently explaining disasters and other causes of human misery, they can also better predict future problems and help minimize the disastrous results. Earlier in this series, I read the opening paragraphs of the Richard Dawkins article called The Theology of the Tsunami. And further on in that article, Dawkins quotes a letter that he wrote that was very critical of a theologian's attempt to offer a religious explanation for the tsunami. And Dawkins explains why these matters should be left to science. And I'm going to read this section. This time I'll spare you my poor imitation of English accent. Not only does science know why the tsunami happened, it can give precious hours of warning. If a small fraction of the tax breaks handed out to churches, mosques, and synagogues had been diverted into an early warning system, tens of thousands of people, now dead, would have been moved to safety. Let's get up off our knees, stop cringing before boogeymen and virtual fathers, face reality, and help science to do something constructive about human suffering. Now, Dawkins got a lot of heat from that letter for being insensitive to people's pain. So he wrote a follow-up letter, and he apologized for his harsh tone. And he explained he was only trying to say that instead of dwelling on prayers to God for forgiveness of sins, or prayers for God's help in healing the injured, or even cursing God for the cruelty, maybe there's a better and more constructive alternative. So Dawkins writes, maybe there's nobody there to curse. Maybe we are on our own, in a world where plate tectonic and other natural forces occasionally cause appalling catastrophes. Science cannot yet prevent earthquakes, but science could have provided just enough warning of the Boxing Day tsunami to save most of the victims and spare the bereaved. And if the comforts afforded by outstretched human arms warm human words and heartbroken human generosity seem puny against the agony, they at least have the advantage of existing in the real world. All right, thank you for watching. That you don't understand.